Hello everyone, this is Christian at Exiton Interactive, and in this video we are going to take a break from dealing with the forms and validation and all that, and just do something completely different, a little interesting. And that's what we're going to do, is deal with the animation of the inputs container. So if we look at the example, what we have is that if the user clicks on the forgot username link, the input container animates out and then back in and has the appropriate controls shown. If you hit the cancel, it'll go out and come back in. In this video, though, we're just going to deal with the animation part, so the out and the in, if the user clicks on the links and or the reset button. Right. And may wonders never cease. In this video, we actually don't have to make any additions or corrections from any previous videos, so we can begin doing the animation right away. We're going to start by modifying our template. So I'm going to open up the authenticator.component.pug file. The first thing that I want to do is we're going to need to animate the inputs container itself. So for the animation purposes, I want to specify an ID for it. And so I'm just going to put the hash, and then we're going to just use the same inputs container for the ID. So now we have the ID on the inputs container. Now we need a way to bind the click event for the links and the button to methods on our TypeScript class. So to do that, we're going to start with the forgot username link. I'm going to use my parentheses here, and we've already seen how to bind properties. That's using the square brackets in the case of this form group. To bind events, we'll use parentheses. So we'll have a set of parentheses. Inside that, the event that we're binding is the click event, and then we need to specify what the methods are that we want to invoke when the user clicks. And in this case, I'm going to say on click forgot username. Important not to forget the parentheses here, because it's going to invoke this method, so we need to use the parentheses. And let me go back to my article, make sure I'm spelling everything right. All right, so we have the on click forgot username. Now we need to do the same thing for the forgot password. So we'll have the click event, and that's going to go to the on click forgot password method. Again, put our parentheses. And finally, we're going to go down to the reset button here, and we'll bind the same event, the click event, equals, and then that will go to the on click reset method. I'm going to save that. Of course, I have the watch running, and then I'm going to go to the TypeScript file, the authenticator component class file. And what I'm going to do is to make those methods so that we can see that everything's been wired up and hopefully spelled correctly. So we're going to have the public on click forgot password method. We're going to use our good friend, the console log. Just say forgot password, public on click forgot username, console log forgot username, and the last one, public on click reset, and console log reset. I'll save that, turn to my browser, and I'm going to refresh. And if I open the console log, hopefully, like I said, I'm going to click here, forgot username, great, forgot password, and reset. It's probably the first time in the past several times of going through this that I actually got those done correctly the first time. So return back to my TypeScript. Actually, if we look, what we'll do real quick is we don't have an href set for these links, the anchors, so we're not getting the default switching of the cursor. So along with that, let's change just a couple other things in the styling. So if we want, we'll go back to the our style sheet, the SAS file for our component. Let's scroll down to the bottom here. So I'm going to say .authenticator, so the class. What I want is, if we look at that, again, the example, what happens, you can see the back here, the background is darker than the other sections. So what we're going to do is we're going to set that the background color for our authenticator. And I set that to 1B, 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 so a darker gray. The anchors on there, we'll just, on all the anchors, we just want the pointer cursor. And the last thing we need to do is the inputs container. Now that I think about it, way back when, I didn't know why I specified the inputs container color, background color, and that was the reason. We want to make this color to be white. We'll refresh that. We'll go back to our browser, refresh. Of course, the only thing we're going to see different is that we now have the cursor going to the pointer when we're over a link. Should actually work also for the others. Okay, so let's go back to Visual Studio. That's all the styling that we need. So I'm gonna close the SAS file, and I'm gonna close the pug file, the template. We don't need to modify the template any longer. And now we're gonna focus basically just on the TypeScript file and one other file that we're going to make here. So we put the ID on our inputs container, and for the purpose of being able to locate that DOM element. And we're going to need to find that. Later on, we'll need to find other components as well, other DOM elements. So what I'm going to do, instead of, we could bring in another library like jQuery, but it doesn't make sense to do all that just to be able to find DOM elements. So we're going to bring in or create another service. So what I'm going to do is return to our services folder. I'm going to right click on it and choose add new item. It's going to be a TypeScript file. That's going to be, we're going to name it DOM, so dom-reader.service.ts. And I'm going to choose add and give it a second to come up here. And now we have our file open. We're going to start off with export a class. I'm going to call it capital letters DOM reader service. My pair programming buddy ReSharper is going to complain about it being, what does it call it, doesn't match the name rule. That's okay, we're going to leave it. You can ignore that. So what we need is a method of finding an element in the DOM. In this particular instance, we know that what we're looking for is a child of the DOM for our component. So I'm going to first create a method. We'll call it public find child by ID. Okay. We're going to make this method a generic method, so it'll help us to, IntelliSense wise. So we'll say T, which is just the generic variable, and we'll say extends, and it extends an HTML element. What I'm going to pass into it is going to be a parent element. It's also going to be HTML, at least for now. And we're going to pass in the ID, which is a string. And I'm going to also have this other variable or argument that I call allow nil. It's going to be a Boolean. And it's going to default to false. We'll see what that's going to be used for here shortly. But finding child by ID is just going to be a specific sub-example of finding a child. So what I'm going to do real quick is just stub out the public find child. It's going to same thing, generic method extends HTML element. And I'm just going to copy these. But instead of having an ID, what we're going to do is have a query selector. Selector. Perfect. Now, this is not the only method, the find child by ID method. It's not the only method that we're going to have that's going to check for something by ID. Obviously, well, not obviously, but we will need eventually just the whole, searching the whole document for an ID, because we won't have the parent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a private method here and parse ID. And the parse ID, of course, can take an ID, which is a string. We're going to, return that ID here in a moment, but we'll do a little bit of error checking first. So let's say if and ID, we'll say type of ID is equal to undefined, or the ID is equal to null, and then we'll have one more, or ID is equal to empty string. If either of those are true, what I want to do is just throw an error to let me know, should be 3 equals. And what I'm going to say here is throw new error, and I'll say cannot find an element using a nil or empty ID. Nil is just a shorthand way from telling myself that it's either undefined or null. And so if either of those are true, we're going to throw an error. Next, I want to say if. So the ID is not an empty string, so it has at least a first element. And if that first element is equal to the hash, I'm just going to remove it. So I'll say ID is equal to ID.substring, substring, and the substring is from the first index on. So 0 we're chopping off, and 1 to the end. And then I'm going to say return ID. So that in the find child by ID method, I'm going to say ID equals this dot parse ID. Okay. And then next I'm going to say return this dot find child. And in here, what I'm going to do, well, first of all, let's just do it this way. We'll say parent, and the next thing that I need to send in is the query selector. So we'll use string interpolation, and we'll do allow nil. Back up there, allow nil, and we'll say as t. It's going to give us an error because right now our find child is a void method. We'll go back up here, and the query selector that we want, we'll put the square brackets, and then we'll say ID equals our pair of double quotes, and inside that our ID. So string interpolation for the ID. Next, we're going to go down to the find child method, and we'll simply say const child is equal to parent dot query selector, and then that'll just be the query selector that we've passed in. Get rid of our red squiggly real quick. What we're going to do is just say return child as t, and that should get rid of our red squiggly, but we will do a little error handling here. So I'm going to say if type of child is equal to undefined or child, and I'd have to look it up. Probably should have already done it. I'm guessing that query selector, if it's not found, will return undefined, but I don't know. I have to look that up. But if it's either undefined or null, what we're going to say is that if, and we have allow nil, if that's true, we're just going to return null. I don't anticipate it being true most of the time. If, like I said previously, that if I'm looking for something and I don't find it, then I want to know pretty much right away. So I'm going to put console dot error, and I'm going to put the parent. That way we'd be able to see in the console the parent, so we can see the structure to help try and figure out what's wrong. And after that, I'm going to say throw new error, and that error, put our back ticks there and say parent does not contain an element with query selector. And we'll say string interpolation for the query selector so that we can see what we attempted to find. I'm going to save that. We are going to return in the future to this class to add some more functionality, but for now that's all we're going to need. So I'm going to go ahead and close the domreader.service.ts file. I'm going to return to the top of our authenticator.component.ts file, and let me bring up notes here before I forget. And what we're going to do is start by importing a couple things. We've just talked about the fact that we're going to search for a child of an element. So we need to have the DOM of our component, and we're going to receive that using the element ref, which is located in the Angular core package. Of course, we made the service now, so what we're going to do is import it. And we'll say from, I'm going to go up twice, it's in the services folder, and I called it dom-reader.service, no .ts. And if we've done everything right, IntelliSense will help us. Now that we have that, we have to be sure to include it in our providers array so that Angular will inject it. And while I'm thinking about it, we have other things to add, but I am going to go ahead and modify the constructor before I forget. Let's format it a little bit better, I guess, maybe. Okay, so what I'll have is private read-only. Let's see, we'll have we'll call it _DOM reader, and it's a DOM reader service. And we also private read-only, and we'll have _element ref, which is, of course, element ref. So that'll take care of the injecting by Angular. So next thing I want to do is create a few fields here. First one, we'll say private _DOM inputs container. This is an HTML and HTML div element. What we're going to do, and we have to be careful in this case, it doesn't necessarily apply because the only time we're going to care about this is through user interaction. They have to click on the link to cause us to work. But we have to be careful where we try to access the DOM in our component, because the view does not exist in the constructor, and depending on what we're trying to do, it might not even be able to be done in the onInit, ng-on-init method. We'll use the correct one later on, but in this case what I'm doing is just creating a backer field, because we're going to do basically lazy finding of this DOM element. If a user does not click on the forgot me or forgot password or forgot username link, then there's no reason for us to have even spent the time finding that element. So we're going to do it lazily. And while we're at it, I'm going to define a couple of flags. Private is subaction forgot password. It's a boolean, and we're going to default to false. I tend to put the types on them even when the compiler can tell what it is through assignment. That's just me. You could leave it off if you want. So we're going to have these sub actions here so that we can tell if the action would be login, but it could be either forgot password or forgot username. So we'll have is sub action forgot username, and that's also false to start with. Next, what we're going to do is create a getter, private get and DOM inputs container. So this is how we're going to get reference of our container. So what we'll do in here is we'll say if and this dot DOM input container. If that's not equal to null, So we've already looked for, we've already found it. So all we need to do is return it. Now, if we have not found it, what we'll do is we'll say this dot input container, and that's going to be equal to this. So we need the DOM reader. And what we're going to do is find child by ID. The type of element that we're looking for is an HTML div element. And the parent is going to be, let's make this on 2 lines, this dot underscore element ref dot native element. So that gives us the actual DOM for our component. And we need the ID. So of course we made it inputs dash container. And that will be all that we need to find the element from the container, or find the inputs container. And so then all we need to do is return this .dom input container. So now we have lazily loaded it. The only time we'll ever need it, well, the only time it'll go out and looking for it, using the DOM reader, is if we actually access this getter. So that takes care of it. What I'm going to do now is just copy these in. I'm just going to put a couple of public getters so that we have access to whether or not it's a sub action, forgot password, or forgot username. So again, just a public way so that we can find it in our template should we need it. And let's see what we need now. Let's go down to our methods that we created earlier. Of course, we'll start with saying this dot is sub action forgot password, and now that's true. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this console statement. We're going to go down here. Whoops. This dot is sub action forgot username. That's equal to true. While we're at it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the method call, and then we'll create the method. With this, we're going to say this dot sub action animate. So that'll be the method that we're going to call. You can see here, like I mentioned before, if you click on the forgot username, what happens? It slides out, but it also hides and brings in the inputs that we need. Similarly, cancel hides the email and then brings back the old inputs. So we're going to need to perform an action within. So it'll animate out, it'll do something and animate back in, and we'll do that by passing in a function to this method. Just copy that into the forgot username. Now if we click on, or do the click or on click reset, what we're going to do is say, so if this dot is sub action forgot password, then we'll say this dot is sub action forgot password is equal to false, and we'll make the call to that animate method, and I'm going to return, so we'll leave after that. And then we'll say exact same thing, except this time for forgot username. Forgot username equals false, animate, and return. Eventually we will have more in this reset because we need to reset it in case it's just clearing the inputs and such. But now we need to deal with the actual animation. We'll scroll down here to the bottom of our file here and create that method. Let me bring up the better notes for this. So we'll have private sub action animate, and we already know that we need we'll say action. We need a function that returns void, and there's no return. And now we're able to start doing our animation. So what we need again is to take the inputs component and move it off to the left. So to move it to the left, we need to know how far to the left we're going, and to get that we're going to call the width is going to equal to this dot DOM inputs container So that's the DOM, and then we'll say client width. Next, so we'll have common settings for both the out animation and the in animation, and the common setting being constant, we'll call it timing, because it's an animation effect timing. And we'll say it's an object here. And then we'll have a duration of 500 milliseconds, so half a second. We'll say easing. We'll give it an easing of ease in, out. And the fill is going to be forwards. So the fill is basically saying whether or not, you know, once the animation is run, whether it should return back to where it was going. And we just want the animation to play forwards. We don't want the backwards part of it. So we have the timing done. Now we can do the actual out animation. So we'll say const out animation, and that's going to be equal to this dot DOM inputs container, and we'll say dot animate. Dot animate takes an object, so the keyframes, and then it takes our timing. So we'll return to our keyframes. One day it'll format correctly. And the first thing that we want to animate is the opacity. So the opacity, so this is the out animation, so the opacity is going to go from 1 to 0 over the duration of the animation. And now we need to move it to the left. And to move to the left, we're going to do transform. And we'll have our array here. And it's an array of strings in this case. So the first one, we'll say transform, translate. So it's starting at 0. So translate 0. And where we're going is translate and parentheses. And we'll get a minus sign. Oops. We'll have a minus sign. And inside here, so we're doing the string interpolation, we have the width. That's in pixels. And let's see, we need to close our parentheses. Okay. Let me format a little bit and we'll save. That actually is, you know, we don't need the variable to do the out. So if we check this now, if we go back to the browser and go to our example and we refresh and cross our fingers, if we click the out or click the link, it now animates out. Reset will do the same thing. Oh, no, because we can go back and fix that before we forget. Because I don't think that on click reset. Nope, I did. Oh, because it has to be true that it's a sub action before it'll animate. So let's just continue where we're going. So we have the out animation done. What we need is for once the container has moved out, we want to do stuff. And to do that, we'll say out, and why are you not helping me? Out animation dot, let's see, on finish. And we're actually going to set the on finish function. And as I mentioned, what happens, you know, it goes out. We want to perform whatever the action is that was passed in. Next, what we're going to do is say we're going to set a timeout. And probably I don't need this timeout. We'll test it once we have everything going. But I'm going to say set timeout, and the duration I'm going to just pick to be half a second as well. Basically what I'm imagining is just for it to hang out over there for a, you know, some time. The action probably is going to be very quick, you know, as far as the computer goes. You know, showing one input or a set of hiding some inputs and showing some inputs is probably going to be instantaneous. So I just want to give it a little bit of a delay before it comes back in. But then we'll say, once the timeout is done, we'll say this dot DOM input container dot animate. Again, two objects. First the keyframes, the next is the timing. And we'll go back up here And let me stick with the formatting that I had from the example. So what we need to do is, of course, change the opacity. And the opacity needs to go from 0 to 1. Next, we need to do our translation. And I'm just going to take this out of here and put it over here. So we're starting out with a negative translation and moving it back to 0. And again, this duration or the timing will take care of adding the duration and such. So we'll save that. We're going to return to our browser and refresh. So now, hopefully, if we cross our fingers again, we click forgot username, it goes out, comes back in. So now the is sub action flag says it's true for forgot username. So if I hit reset, it'll go out, come back in. We'll update here. If you look in the example, if we hit forgot username, it doesn't say reset, it says cancel. It's a little more user friendly to know what to do. Forgot username, reset. And if I hit reset a few times here, it doesn't do anything. And we can actually see a little bit better what it's going to look like if we go to the containing div, the authenticator div, and I give it an overflow of hidden. So now we'll get a better idea what it should look like. And it's a little bit better looking that way. And of course, we'll set it up so that once it animates out and comes back in, you know, it'll focus the element and those kind of things. But for now, we've actually done our first bit of animation. Main animations we have left are basically, you know, once the input is highlighted, the particular info should be shown, and we need to animate the transition between password and confirmed password, for example. But for now, that I think will take care of it for this video. As usual, now I've gotten into the habit, I want to remind you that if you have any comments or suggestions, complaints, whatever, just please leave it in the comments section below. And of course, I will talk to you later.